The alarm in my chest went off before the real one did. I remember that moment clearly, because it was the first time I understood that fear has a sound of its own, separate from sirens and separate from voices. It lives somewhere behind the ribs, and it wakes up before your mind catches up to what your body already knows. We were standing in a cold steel room on the training deck of the Coalition Academy, 40 of us, from 11 different worlds, and none of us were breathing normally. In front of us floated Instructor, our instructor drone, a smooth gray sphere with a single blue lens that never blinked and never showed mercy. It had just given us our assignment, and the assignment was simple in words and impossible in weight. Build a weapon. Use only what is in the salvage bin. You have 1 hour. Whatever you build will decide whether you are fit to wear the uniform of the fleet. I am Nadia Hartwell, and at the time, I was 17 years old, the only human in a room built for people twice my height and 4 times my strength. I had grown used to being stared at like a strange animal in a zoo built for giants. But that day, the staring stopped being about my size. It became about someone else entirely. Her name was Mara Ellison, and she was standing 2 places to my left, looking at the salvage bin the way someone looks at a menu in a restaurant they've never been able to afford. Calm, unbothered, almost amused. I want to tell this story from the beginning, because if I skip ahead, you will not believe what happened next, and you deserve to understand exactly how far it went, and exactly how close we came to losing something none of us expected to lose that day. The Grethi cadet beside me, a broad-shouldered boy named Caleb Grant, was already elbow-deep in the bin, pulling out a rail spike frame and muttering under his breath about voltage ratios. Across the room, twin cadets from the Voss colony, a brother and sister named Owen and Ellie Marsh, were assembling a heat lance out of scavenged conduit, their hands moving with the practiced speed of people who had trained for this moment their entire lives. Everyone had trained for this moment their entire lives, except for the 2 of us who weren't born into war. Instructor hovered at the front of the room, sensor lens sweeping left to right, cataloging every movement, every hesitation, every spark of ambition. It did not speak unless spoken to, and even then, only to correct. I grabbed a coil housing and a spool of conductive wire, planning to build something fast and loud, because loud things get noticed, and noticed things get remembered, and remembered cadets get recruited. That was the entire philosophy of the academy. Power equals worth. Damage equals value. If your weapon could not hurt something, you yourself were considered nothing. Mara did not seem to know this rule, or she knew it and had already decided to break it. She reached past the coil housings, past the rail spike frames, past every obviously dangerous piece of scrap, and instead pulled out 2 long strips of wood composite, a spool of thin cable line, and a bent alloy rod nobody else had bothered to touch. I watched her weigh the wood composite in her hands like she was testing the give of a mattress before buying it. Someone laughed. It was quiet, but in a room where every other sound had gone silent with focus, quiet laughter is loud enough to sting. I leaned toward her without meaning to. My mouth moved before my brain approved it. "Mara," I whispered, "that's not going to work. You need something with output, something that hits." She looked at me, and there was no worry in her eyes at all, which confused me more than anything else that day. "Everything hits," she said. "The question is whether you know exactly where you're aiming." I did not understand what she meant. Not then. I filed the sentence away in the back of my mind the way you file away a stranger's offhand comment, expecting never to need it again. We went back to our work. I built my coil-driven dart launcher with shaking hands, testing the tension twice, worried it would misfire in front of the entire class. Caleb finished his rail spike early and spent the remaining minutes polishing it, clearly proud of the dull metallic shine along its edge. Owen and Ellie worked in perfect sync, their heat lance humming faintly even before they connected the final wire, 2 people who had clearly built weapons together before and would again. And Mara sat in the corner, quietly bending the wood composite strips into a curve, running the cable line between the 2 tips, testing the draw with her fingers, over and over, adjusting the tension by feel rather than by tool. She hummed while she worked. A tune I didn't recognize, something soft, almost like a lullaby, completely out of place in a room built to measure how efficiently we could hurt things. I want you to understand what it felt like to watch someone build something so plain in a room full of things built to end lives. It did not look impressive. It did not look dangerous. It looked, if I am honest, like a mistake. By the time the hour ended, 39 cadets stood at their stations holding weapons that gleamed with obvious menace. Rail spikes, heat lances, compressed gas launchers, one particularly disturbing device built by a Cathari cadet that looked like it could puncture reinforced hull plating from 30 meters away. And then there was Mara, standing quietly with a bow. A simple recurve frame, hand-lashed from struts and cable, with a handful of straightened alloy rods serving as arrows. It looked like something a child might carry in an old adventure story, not something built inside a military academy, under the watchful lens of an instructor drone whose entire purpose was measuring lethality. The laughter that had been quiet before became something else entirely, not cruel exactly, but dismissive in a way that felt worse. Cadets from 3 different worlds exchanged glances, some smirking, some outright shaking their heads. I heard someone behind me mutter that the humans had finally run out of ideas. I felt embarrassed for her. I felt embarrassed for myself, by association, because we were the only 2 humans in that room, and whatever she did next would reflect on both of us, whether either of us wanted it to or not. Inster 9 approached the line of cadets, moving with the slow, deliberate hover pattern it used when scoring. It stopped at each station for exactly 4 seconds, scanning the weapon, comparing it against some internal database of destructive potential, then moving to the next. It reached Caleb first. His rail spike earned an approving tone from the drone's speaker, a rare compliment. It reached Owen and Ellie, and their heat lance earned the same. Down the line it went, cadet after cadet, weapon after weapon, each one measured, weighed, and approved or noted for improvement. Then it reached Mara. I watched the blue lens tilt, just slightly, the mechanical equivalent of raising an eyebrow. It hovered closer to her than it had to anyone else, close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet its lens directly. Cadet Ellison, it said, its voice flat and synthetic, without warmth or cruelty, simply without either. This construction registers as primitive, non-compliant with modern combat standards, insufficient lethality rating. Explain your reasoning, if you have any. The room went utterly silent. Even the ventilation system seemed to hold its breath. Mara looked at the drone for a long moment before answering, and when she spoke, her voice was calm in a way that made the silence feel even heavier. I don't need to explain it, she said. You'll understand in about 4 seconds. I did not know, at that moment, that she was not being clever. She was being precise. 4 seconds was exactly the amount of time Inster 9 spent at each station before moving on, and she had already counted it, already timed it, already understood the pattern the drone had followed with every single cadet in that room, myself included. The drone's lens flickered, a small motion I would later learn indicated processing, recalculating, questioning, insufficient lethality rating. It repeated, "Please demonstrate on the target range if you believe otherwise." That was the last full sentence Inster 9 spoke to any of us that day. Mara did not walk toward the target range at the far end of the room where the paper silhouettes hung waiting to be perforated by every other cadet's weapon. Instead, she reached back, drew a single arrow from the small quiver she had assembled from a strip of leftover cable sheath, and knocked it against the cable line in one smooth motion that looked far too practiced for someone who had supposedly built this weapon in under an hour. I noticed her eyes shift, not toward the target range, but toward Inster 9 itself, still hovering at what the Academy called safe evaluation distance, a distance every student had been taught was outside the reach of any handheld weapon we could reasonably construct. I want to be honest about what I felt in that exact second, because it matters for everything that came after. I felt afraid, not of the drone, of her, of the stillness in her shoulders, the absence of hesitation, the way her breathing had slowed instead of quickened, as though the entire room had gone quiet inside her mind, long before it went quiet around us. She drew the bowstring back, and for the first time since we had entered that classroom, the mockery stopped completely. Every cadet in that room, human and otherwise, understood at the exact same moment that something was about to happen that none of us had been trained to expect. Instranine's lens remained fixed on her, still processing, still calculating the words for whatever correction it planned to issue next. Mara exhaled slowly and released. The sound was smaller than I expected. A soft thrum of cable, a whisper of displaced air, nothing like the violent crack of a rail spike or the hum of a heat lance charging. It should have felt insignificant. It should have looked like nothing. Instead, the alloy rod crossed the room faster than my eyes could properly track, and struck Instr-9 directly through the center of its sensor housing, the one part of its entire construction that had never been designed to take a direct hit, because no cadet weapon in the Academy's recorded history had ever been aimed at the drone itself, let alone one built from scrap wood and cable in under an hour. There was a sound, like glass, cracking inside a metal shell, a shower of small blue sparks, and then Instr-9 dropped out of the air and struck the floor with a heavy, final thud that echoed through the entire room far longer than it should have. For a moment, nobody moved, nobody breathed. The only sound left in that classroom was the faint electrical hiss coming from the drone's broken housing, sparks fading into silence. I looked at Mara. She was already lowering the bow, her expression unreadable, watching the drone's motionless body on the floor, with something that was not triumph, and was not fear, but a kind of quiet, patient understanding, as though she had simply confirmed something she already knew would be true. I did not know it then, standing frozen in that cold steel room with 38 other cadets who had all built weapons meant to end lives and had all failed to do what she had just done with a piece of bent wood, but I was about to learn exactly what it meant to underestimate a human being who had taken the time to understand where the armor wasn't. That single moment, the crack of an arrow against a drone's sensor housing, would ripple outward across the entire coalition faster than any of us could have imagined, and it would not stop rippling for a very long time. The alarms started 12 seconds later, and by then it was already too late to pretend nothing had happened. Red light washed across the training deck, pulsing in rhythm with a siren that none of us had ever heard triggered by anything other than a hull breach drill. Cadets scattered backward from their stations instinctively, as though the broken drone on the floor might still be dangerous, might still reach out and punish someone for what had just occurred in front of it. Caleb Grant was the first to speak, his voice cracking with something between disbelief and fear. "What did you do?" he said, staring at Mara like she had grown a second head. "You can't hit an instructor unit. Nobody's weapon is even rated to reach that range safely." Mara did not answer him immediately. She was watching the drone's shattered housing with the same calm focus she had used to draw the bowstring, as though she were studying the aftermath of an experiment rather than the wreckage of a supposedly untouchable machine. I asked, because someone had to ask it out loud, whether she had meant to hit it or whether it had been some kind of accident, a stray shot gone wrong in the panic of demonstration. She looked at me, and for the first time that day, I saw something close to tiredness in her expression, the look of someone who had explained this too many times before to people who had never needed to understand it. "I aimed exactly where I intended to aim," she said quietly. "I watched it score every other station before mine, 4 seconds each time, always from the same angle, always hovering at the same height, always keeping its lens forward, because that's the only part of it built to actually see. Nobody ever aims at the thing doing the grading. Everyone aims at the target they're told to aim at." I did not have a response to that. None of us did. The door at the far end of the training deck slid open with a hiss, and a tall administrator in fleet gray stormed in, flanked by 2 security officers whose hands rested near sidearms they had clearly never expected to need inside a classroom. The administrator's eyes swept the room once, taking in the scattered cadets, the abandoned weapons, the broken drone still smoking faintly on the floor, before settling on Mara, who had already set her bow down on the workbench beside her, as though surrendering a tool rather than a weapon. "Explain," the administrator said, his voice tight with the particular kind of controlled anger that comes from someone who knows they will have to answer for this to people above them. Mara explained, and her explanation was so simple that it somehow made everything worse. She said that the assignment had been to build a weapon capable of striking a target, and that she had built exactly that. She said that nobody had specified which target, and that she had chosen the one measuring her, rather than the one hanging harmlessly at the far end of the room. She said this without defiance, without pride, simply stating facts the way someone recites a recipe. The administrator's jaw tightened. Around us, cadets whispered to each other in at least 6 different languages, and though I could not understand most of them, I recognized the tone in every single one. Fear dressed up as curiosity. I want you to understand something about that room, about that academy, about the entire structure the coalition had built around the idea of measuring worth through destruction. Instr 9 was not simply a teaching tool, it was a symbol. Every species represented in that classroom had been taught, in one way or another, that strength was measured by output, by force, by how loudly and how visibly you could break something. Mara had broken the thing measuring everyone else, using the quietest weapon in the room, and she had done it by refusing to accept the rules of where a weapon was supposed to point. The 2 security officers exchanged a glance, and then one of them reached for a communicator on his shoulder, murmuring something too low for me to catch. Though I caught enough words to understand, he was requesting a report be filed directly with Fleet Command, rather than the Academy's internal review board. That alone told me this was no longer a matter of classroom discipline. It had become something larger, something that would travel far beyond these 4 walls before the day was over. Cadet Ellison, the administrator said finally, his voice regaining some measure of composure, "You will come with us for review." Immediately. Mara nodded once, unbothered, and walked toward the door without looking back at the rest of us, without offering any explanation beyond what she had already given, without so much as glancing at the wreckage she had left behind on the floor. I stood there afterward, along with the other cadets, staring at the space where Instr 9 used to hover, feeling a strange mixture of awe and unease settle over the room. Nobody spoke for a long time. Nobody quite knew what to say. Owen Marsh finally broke the silence, his voice quieter than I had heard it all day. "That drone has scored every graduating class for the last 6 years," he said. "Nobody's ever even scratched it." "She didn't scratch it," Ellie Marsh replied, her eyes still fixed on the wreckage. "She put an arrow straight through the one part of it that couldn't be replaced without a full rebuild." I thought about Mara's words from earlier, the ones I had dismissed as strange and unimportant. Everything hits. The question is whether you know exactly where you're aiming. I understood now what she had meant, though understanding it did nothing to make the moment feel any less unsettling. That night, alone in my quarters, I could not stop replaying the sound the arrow had made as it struck the drone's housing, that small, almost gentle crack that had somehow ended something none of us believed could be ended. I thought about all the loud, powerful weapons built by cadets who had trained their entire lives for combat, weapons that had impressed the drone without ever threatening it, and I thought about the one quiet weapon that had been built by someone who had simply refused to accept that the target had already been chosen for her. I did not know yet what would happen to Mara, whether she would be expelled, disciplined, or something far worse. I did not know that the report filed that night would travel further and faster than any of us could have predicted, reaching desks far beyond the Academy's administration, reaching officers who had spent decades studying human behavior with a mixture of curiosity and quiet dread. I only knew, standing in my quarters that night, staring at the ceiling instead of sleeping, that something fundamental had shifted in the room that day, something that could not be undone simply by repairing a broken drone and moving on to the next lesson. The coalition had spent generations building an entire framework around measuring strength through visible, obvious power, and in less than 4 seconds, a girl with a bow, made from scrap wood, had shown an entire classroom that the framework itself had a blind spot nobody had ever thought to check. I did not know it then, but that blind spot had a name, and it was about to become very, very important to every species in that room, and to many more who would hear about it in the weeks that followed. The next morning, I was called in for questioning, along with every other cadet who had been present in that classroom, and it was during those long hours of careful, repetitive interviews that I began to understand just how far the ripples from that single arrow had already traveled, and how little any of us actually understood about what humanity was capable of when it stopped playing by rules it had never agreed to in the first place. They separated us into different rooms before the questioning began, which told me immediately that whoever was running this investigation did not want our stories to blend together. I sat alone in a narrow grey office for nearly an hour before anyone came to speak with me, and in that hour I had nothing to do but replay the sound of the arrow again and again in my mind, wondering how something so small could have caused so much movement within a single night. The officer who finally entered was not from the academy staff. I noticed that immediately, because she wore a uniform I did not recognize, dark blue instead of the grey worn by instructors, with a small emblem on her shoulder that I would later learn belonged to Fleet Intelligence rather than Fleet Command. She introduced herself as Officer Grace Bennett, and she carried a data slate that she did not look at once during our entire conversation, which unsettled me more than anything she actually said. "Walk me through what you saw," she said, sitting across from me with the kind of stillness that made me feel like every word I chose mattered more than I understood. I told her everything, starting with the salvage bin, the way Mara had ignored every obviously dangerous piece of scrap in favor of wood and cable, the quiet way she had tested tension with her fingers instead of a tool, the 4 seconds Instra 9 spent scoring each station before moving on. When I mentioned the timing, the officer's expression shifted, just slightly, a small tightening around her eyes that told me I had said something she considered important. She counted the interval. Officer Bennett repeated, more to herself than to me, before the drone reached her station. I told her yes, as far as I could tell, and I explained the sentence Mara had said to me earlier, about everything hitting, about knowing exactly where you aim. Officer Bennett wrote nothing down, but I noticed her jaw tighten slightly, the same controlled reaction I had seen in the administrator the night before. "Did she seem frightened at any point?" the officer asked. "Angry, excited, anything?" I thought about it honestly before answering, because I did not want to give her a version of events shaped by my own confusion rather than what I had actually witnessed. "No," I said. She seemed calm, the same way she seemed the entire time she was building it. Officer Bennett nodded slowly, and for a moment, something crossed her face that looked almost like recognition, as though I had confirmed a theory she already suspected but had not yet proven. "That's what concerns us," she said quietly, and then, seeming to catch herself sharing more than she intended, she closed the conversation and thanked me for my cooperation. I left that room with more questions than I had walked in with, and over the following days, those questions only multiplied as fragments of information filtered through the cadet barracks in whispers and half-confirmed rumors. I learned that Mara had not been expelled, which surprised nearly everyone who heard it, myself included. I learned that she had not even been formally disciplined, at least not in any way the academy typically handled violations of classroom conduct. Instead, she had been moved to a separate wing of the facility, one normally reserved for advanced tactical assessment, a section of the academy most cadets never saw during their entire time there. Caleb Grant, who had a talent for hearing things he probably shouldn't have, told me during a meal break that the broken drone had been sent off-site for analysis rather than simple repair, which meant someone higher up wanted to understand exactly how the damage had occurred, rather than simply fixing it and moving on. He also told me, lowering his voice, as though the walls themselves might report back to someone, that 3 senior officers from Fleet Command had arrived at the academy within 18 hours of the incident, which was unusually fast for anything related to a training exercise. I did not think much of it at first. I assumed it was simply protocol, an overreaction from an institution unused to having its evaluation systems questioned, let alone damaged. It was only later, once I understood the scale of what had actually been triggered that day, that I realized how wrong that assumption had been. The other cadets in my year began treating me differently after that day, though not in the way I expected. I thought they might mock me, the way some of them had mocked Mara before the arrow struck true, but instead, a strange kind of caution crept into how people spoke to me, as though my proximity to what had happened made me somehow dangerous by association, even though I had built nothing more threatening than a coil-driven dart launcher that had barely dented its target. Owen Marsh approached me one evening in the mess hall, sitting across from me without asking permission, which was unusual for him. He asked whether I had known Mara before the academy, whether we had trained together, whether humans were taught these kinds of tactics from childhood. I told him honestly that I had barely spoken to her before that day, that we had simply been assigned to sit near each other, two humans placed together, the way the academy tended to group species for administrative convenience, rather than any deeper reasoning. He did not seem to believe me entirely, and I understood why. It was easier for him to imagine that humans possessed some hidden, coordinated understanding of unconventional tactics passed down through careful teaching, than to accept that a 17-year-old girl had simply looked at a problem differently than everyone else in the room and had arrived at an answer nobody had thought to prepare for. Ellie Marsh was more direct about her curiosity than her brother. She asked me plainly, during a training session a few days later, whether all humans thought this way, whether we were taught to look past the obvious target toward whatever was actually measuring us. I told her I did not know the answer, because I genuinely did not. I had never thought about it before that day either. It was during one of these conversations that I first heard the term that would follow humanity through the rest of my time at the academy, and long after. Someone, I no longer remember who, used the phrase asymmetric thinking to describe what Mara had done, and the phrase spread through the cadet population faster than any official explanation ever could have. It became shorthand for a kind of unpredictability that made people uneasy in a way raw power never had. Power, after all, could be measured, compared, ranked. A heat lance was stronger than a coil launcher, which was stronger than nothing at all. Every species in that academy had built their military doctrine around measurable strength, around knowing exactly how dangerous an opponent was before ever engaging them. What Mara had shown, without meaning to teach a lesson at all, was that the most dangerous thing in a room was not always the loudest weapon. Sometimes it was the quietest person, patiently counting the seconds between one scan and the next, waiting for the exact moment when everyone else's attention was pointed somewhere other than where it needed to be. I did not see Mara again for nearly 2 weeks after the incident. During that time, the academy continued its routines as though nothing unusual had occurred, though I noticed subtle changes that told a different story. A new instructor drone appeared in our classroom, slightly larger, with additional plating around its sensor housing that had not existed on the previous model. Nobody explained the change, but nobody needed to. I also noticed that the evaluation criteria for our next assignment had shifted in a way that felt directly connected to what had happened. Instead of simply building a weapon capable of striking a stationary target, we were now asked to identify potential vulnerabilities in our own evaluation process before beginning construction, a strange and uncomfortable new requirement that several cadets grumbled about, not understanding why the academy had suddenly decided this mattered. I understood exactly why, even if I did not say so out loud. When Mara finally returned to our shared classes, she looked exactly the same as she had before, calm, quiet, unbothered by the attention that followed her through every hallway. She did not offer any explanation for where she had been, and when cadets asked her directly, she simply said that she had been asked a great many questions by a great many people, and that she had answered them all as honestly as she had answered mine. I found a private moment to speak with her during a break between sessions, curiosity finally overtaking my hesitation to approach someone who had become, without asking for it, the center of a growing storm none of us fully understood yet. "Are you in trouble?" I asked her directly, because I did not know a gentler way to phrase the question that had been sitting in my chest for 2 weeks. She considered the question longer than I expected before answering. "I don't think trouble is the right word," she said finally. "I think they're trying to figure out what to do with someone who broke a rule nobody had written down yet." I asked her whether she regretted it, whether she wished she had built something louder, something that would not have drawn this much attention toward her. She shook her head slowly. "I built exactly what I meant to build," she said. "I'm not sorry the drone got what it was measuring for. I'm just surprised it took this long for someone to try." I did not fully understand what she meant by that until much later, when I learned just how many cadets, across how many years, had quietly noticed the same blind spot in the evaluation system, and had chosen, for one reason or another, never to test it. Mara had not been the first person to think of aiming at the thing doing the grading. She had simply been the first person willing to actually do it. That distinction, I would come to understand, was the entire difference between a species that respected power and a species that respected results, regardless of how uncomfortable those results made everyone else feel. 3 days later, an announcement came through the Academy's communication system that changed the tone of everything happening around us. A vessel had been cleared for approach to the orbital station above the Academy, a vessel that Fleet Command had specifically requested be granted priority docking ahead of scheduled supply runs and diplomatic shuttles alike. The announcement did not specify what kind of vessel it was, or why it required such unusual priority, but within hours, every cadet in the Academy knew exactly what was approaching, because the class and design designation had leaked through channels nobody could quite trace back to a single source. It was a human warship, and it was the first one many of the non-human cadets in that academy had ever seen with their own eyes, arriving less than 3 weeks after a 17-year-old cadet had put an arrow through the sensor housing of a machine nobody believed could be touched. I remember standing at the observation window with Caleb Grant beside me, watching the distant shape resolve itself against the darkness, and I remember him saying, quietly, that he had a feeling the arrow through that drone had not been an isolated incident at all, but a small, quiet preview of something far larger that the rest of the galaxy was only now beginning to notice. I did not disagree with him. I simply kept watching the ship grow larger in the window, feeling that same fear from the classroom settle back into my chest, the one that lives behind the ribs and wakes up before the mind understands exactly why. The ship did not look the way I expected a warship to look, and that alone told me something important about how humans approached the idea of strength. I had grown up around coalition vessels my entire life at the Academy, ships bristling with visible weapon arrays, hulls plated in layers, designed to be seen and understood as threatening from a distance. Every coalition warship communicated its danger before it ever fired a single shot, because intimidation was considered part of its function. The human vessel drifting into the orbital dock above us looked almost plain by comparison. Long, dark, angular, in ways that seemed designed more for efficiency than for display, with no obvious weapon ports visible from where we stood at the observation window. Ellie Marsh, standing beside me, voiced the exact thought running through my own mind. "It doesn't even look armed," she said, squinting at the distant shape as though she might be missing something obvious. Caleb Grant, who had spent considerably more time studying fleet vessel classifications than either of us, shook his head slowly. "That's the part that should worry you," he said. "Ours are built to be seen. Theirs are built to be underestimated right up until the moment it stops mattering what you thought about them." I did not know at the time how accurate that observation would turn out to be, but I would learn soon enough. The Academy's administration called an assembly the following morning, gathering every cadet from every year into the main auditorium, an unusual event that had not occurred since the start of the academic term. I sat between Caleb and the Marsh twins, feeling the nervous energy of the room pressing against me from every direction, 40 different species, all sharing the same uncertain question without saying it aloud. Why had a human warship been given priority docking above our training facility, and what did it have to do with the incident that had happened 3 weeks earlier? The answer arrived not through the administrator who usually ran these assemblies, but through a fleet command officer I did not recognize, a tall man with gray hair and the kind of quiet authority that made the entire auditorium fall silent the moment he stepped onto the stage. He introduced himself as Commander Lucas Bryant, and he did not waste time on pleasantries. 3 weeks ago, he said, a cadet in this academy demonstrated a capability that this institution's evaluation systems were not designed to measure. I am here to discuss what that demonstration revealed about how we have been training every one of you. A murmur rippled through the auditorium, quickly silenced by the commander's raised hand. For decades, he continued, the coalition has measured combat readiness through output. Force, damage, the size and speed of what a cadet can build to destroy a target placed in front of them. This methodology has served us adequately against threats that value the same measurements we do. It has never once been tested against an opponent who does not. He paused, letting the silence stretch long enough that I could hear my own heartbeat. 3 weeks ago, we received confirmation of something Fleet Intelligence has suspected for some time, based on limited engagement history with human military doctrine. Humans do not measure strength the way the rest of the coalition does. They measure understanding. A human cadet, given the same assignment as every other student in this academy, did not ask what weapon would hit hardest. She asked what the evaluation itself had failed to account for, and she built precisely enough to exploit that gap. I glanced sideways at Caleb, whose expression had shifted from curiosity to something closer to unease. Around the auditorium, similar expressions were spreading through the crowd, a slow dawning realization that the story they had heard through rumor was now being confirmed from an official stage, with far greater weight than any whispered version could carry. "This is not a story about a broken drone," Commander Bryant continued. "This is a story about an entire species that has spent its recorded history solving problems by refusing to accept the terms those problems were presented under. The vessel currently docked above this facility carries a crew who have spent decades engaging threats the rest of the coalition considers unbeatable, not by building bigger weapons, but by finding the one detail everyone else overlooked." He gestured, and the wide display screen behind him activated, showing a series of images I did not immediately understand. Debris fields, damaged hulls belonging to vessels I did not recognize, marked with insignia from species I had never encountered directly. Coordinates and dates scrolling beneath each image. "These are engagement records from the outer conflict zones," he said. "Threats that outmatched coalition forces in every measurable category. Firepower, numbers, technology. In every case, human vessels resolved these engagements not through superior force, but through solutions the opposing side never anticipated, because those solutions did not follow any recognized rule of engagement." I felt the weight of the room shift around me, 40 species absorbing the same uncomfortable realization at once. We had spent our entire education believing that strength could be measured, ranked, compared, and prepared for. What the commander was describing, calmly and without any trace of exaggeration, was a species that had built its entire military philosophy around making that measurement impossible. "The cadet you knew as a strange outlier 3 weeks ago," Commander Bryant said, "is not an outlier at all. She is simply young and largely untrained, compared to what her species is capable of producing when properly developed. That should concern every one of you far more than it should reassure you." The assembly ended without further explanation, and the commander left the stage as quickly as he had arrived, leaving 40 species behind him, carrying a very different understanding of the girl who had built a bow instead of a rail spike. I found Mara later that day, sitting alone near the edge of the training field, watching the distant shape of the warship through the atmospheric shielding above us. She did not look surprised when I sat down beside her, though I had not announced myself. "They gave a whole speech about you," I told her, watching her face for any reaction. She shrugged slightly, still watching the ship. "I figured they would eventually," she said. "It usually takes about this long for people to stop being angry and start being curious." I asked her whether the ship above us had anything to do with her specifically, whether Fleet Command had summoned an entire warship because of what had happened in that classroom. She was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I don't think it's about me," she said finally. "I think it's about what happens next, now that everyone knows the drone could be broken. Someone's going to have to decide what to do about cadets who figure that out on their own from now on, and I don't think anyone in this academy actually knows the answer yet." I asked her whether she was frightened by any of this, by the sudden attention, by the warship, by the way every conversation in the academy now seemed to circle back to her name, whether she was present or not. She turned to look at me then, and there was something in her expression I had not seen before. Not fear exactly, but a kind of quiet resolve that made me understand, for the first time, that she had known something the rest of us had not, long before she ever picked up that bent alloy rod in the salvage bin. "I'm not frightened of the ship," she said. "I'm frightened of what happens if everyone forgets the lesson once the fear wears off. Power isn't the thing that should scare people, understanding is, and most people stop being scared of understanding the moment they convince themselves it doesn't apply to them. I did not fully grasp the weight of what she was telling me until the following day, when a shuttle descended from the warship above and touched down on the Academy's landing platform, carrying a small crew whose presence would reshape everything the Academy believed it understood about its own training methods and about the species it had spent so long underestimating. The shuttle landed without ceremony, which surprised me more than a grand arrival would have. I had expected something loud, something that announced itself the way coalition vessels always did, but the human shuttle simply descended, settled onto the platform with barely a sound, and opened its hatch as though it were dropping off cargo rather than delivering the crew of a warship that had just rearranged the Academy's entire sense of order. 4 figures walked down the ramp, and I watched from the observation deck alongside dozens of other cadets who had gathered the moment word spread that the shuttle had touched down. 3 of them wore the same dark uniform I had seen on Commander Bryant the day before, though none of them carried themselves with his particular formality. The 4th figure was smaller, younger, dressed in a simpler uniform that marked her as a cadet rather than an officer, and it took me a moment to realize why that detail unsettled me so deeply. Fleet Command had brought a cadet of their own, someone roughly my age, to walk alongside seasoned officers as though her presence there was entirely ordinary. Caleb noticed it at the same moment I did, and I heard him exhale slowly beside me. "They brought a kid," he said, disbelief coloring his voice. Why would they bring a kid to something like this? I did not have an answer, though I suspected, even then, that the answer would matter a great deal once we learned it. The officers were escorted directly into the Academy's administrative wing, and for the rest of that day, the cadet body buzzed with speculation nobody could confirm. Some believed the young cadet had been brought as an example, proof that human training produced results like Mara's far earlier than the Coalition's own systems managed. Others believed she was simply along for observation, gathering information about a system her own species intended to study rather than adopt. I did not learn the truth until the following morning, when Mara was summoned to the administrative wing alongside a small group of instructors and officers, and I was, unexpectedly, summoned along with her. I want to be honest about how strange that felt, sitting in a conference room meant for senior staff, alongside Commander Bryant, 2 Academy administrators, Officer Grace Bennett from Fleet Intelligence, and the young human cadet from the warship, who introduced herself simply as Noah Pratt, without any of the formality the officers around her seemed to expect from everyone else in the room. "I did not build anything special," Noah said, when Commander Bryant introduced her, and explained that her presence was meant to provide context for the Academy staff. "My instructors just taught us to ask a different question before we started building anything at all." One of the Academy administrators, a stern woman I recognized from disciplinary hearings but had never spoken with directly, leaned forward with obvious skepticism. "And what question is that?" she asked, her tone carrying the particular edge of someone who has already decided they will not be impressed by the answer. Noah did not seem bothered by the tone at all. "Who's actually grading me?" she said simply. "Not who's the target, who's the judge. Because the target almost never has the power to decide whether you pass or fail. The judge does. If you spend all your effort on the thing you're told to hit, and none of it on the thing that decides whether hitting it counts, you've already lost before you started building anything." The room fell quiet after that, and I noticed Officer Bennett writing something down for the first time since I had met her weeks earlier. Commander Bryant turned toward Mara, who had been listening quietly without interjecting. "Is that consistent with your own reasoning?" he asked her directly. Mara nodded slowly. "Nobody taught me that exact question," she said, "but it's close enough. I didn't grow up training for combat the way she probably did. I just noticed that the drone spent more attention grading us than protecting itself, and once I noticed that, it seemed strange that nobody else had tried to test it." The administrator who had spoken earlier shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "You're describing an entire generation of cadets who overlooked an obvious vulnerability," she said, though her tone had softened slightly from its earlier skepticism. Commander Bryant answered before either of the girls could respond. "They didn't overlook it," he said. "They were trained not to see it. Every species in this academy builds its combat doctrine around respecting the terms of an engagement, including the terms of how they are evaluated. Humans are taught, almost from childhood, to question whether those terms deserve respect in the first place. That is not a difference in intelligence. It is a difference in what each species considers worth challenging. I sat quietly through most of that meeting, absorbing far more than I contributed, but near its end, Officer Bennett turned to me directly with a question I had not expected. "You witnessed the entire construction process," she said. "Did anything about how Cadet Ellison worked strike you as unusual, beyond the choice of materials?" I thought about it carefully before answering, wanting to give her something honest, rather than something I assumed she wanted to hear. "She hummed while she worked," I said finally. "The whole time. Like she wasn't worried at all about what anyone else in the room thought of what she was building." Officer Bennett exchanged a brief glance with Commander Bryant, and I noticed something pass between them that I did not fully understand until much later, a kind of confirmation neither of them said aloud. "That confidence," Commander Bryant said quietly, almost to himself, "is the part that should concern this academy more than the arrow itself. A weapon can be replicated. Confidence built on genuinely understanding a problem cannot be manufactured through training alone. It has to be allowed to develop, and most systems, including this one, are built to punish exactly the kind of thinking that produces it." The meeting ended shortly after that, and as we filed out of the conference room, Noah fell into step beside me, studying me with open curiosity rather than the caution most cadets in the academy now treated Mara and me with. "You're human too, right?" she said, though it was clearly not really a question. I told her yes, and admitted that I had spent most of the last few weeks feeling like I was watching everything from the outside, even though people kept assuming I understood things I genuinely did not. She laughed softly at that, a sound that felt strangely normal after weeks of tension. "Honestly," she said, "most of us feel that way most of the time too. We're not taught to have all the answers. We're just taught not to be afraid of not having them yet." I asked her, carefully, whether she thought Mara was in danger, whether the sudden attention from Fleet Command and the arrival of an entire warship meant something bad was coming for her. Noah considered the question with more seriousness than I expected. "I think the opposite is more likely," she said. "I think they're trying to figure out how to protect what she just proved, before someone decides it's easier to bury the lesson than deal with what it means for how this whole academy trains people." I did not fully understand what she meant until later that evening, when word spread through the cadet barracks that the academy's board of directors had called an emergency session, one that would decide not just Mara's future within the academy, but the future of the evaluation system itself, and by extension, the future of how every species within the coalition would be taught to measure strength from that point forward. I remember standing outside the administrative wing that night, watching lights burning late behind reinforced windows, feeling the same fear from the classroom settle into my chest again, quieter this time, but no less certain that whatever decision emerged from that room would ripple far beyond the walls of a single training academy. I did not sleep that night, and it turned out that my sleeplessness was the least unusual thing happening within the academy walls before morning arrived. Sometime near the middle of the night cycle, an alarm tone I had never heard before rolled through the barracks, different from the drill signals we had all memorized during our first month of training. This one carried a rising pitch that made every hair on my arms stand up before my mind had even processed what it meant. I sat up in the darkness, listening to doors opening along the corridor, cadets stumbling out of their rooms in various states of undress, all of us searching each other's faces for some explanation none of us had. Caleb appeared in the corridor a moment later, pulling on a jacket, his expression tighter than I had seen it since the day the arrow struck Instru 9. "That's not a drill signal," he said, before I could even ask. "That's a containment alert. Something's loose on the lower training levels." I did not fully understand what containment alert meant, not in practical terms, until an automated announcement crackled through the corridor speakers, instructing all cadets to remain in their quarters, unless directed otherwise by academy staff. The instruction did nothing to calm the growing knot in my stomach, because underneath the calm automated voice, I could hear something else entirely, the distant, muffled sound of raised voices and hurried footsteps moving through levels of the facility we were never permitted to visit. Ellie Marsh found us a few minutes later, her face pale in the corridor lighting. "It's the salvage archive," she said, breathless from running. "One of the retired instructor units they pulled offline after the incident. It wasn't fully decommissioned. Something in its systems triggered a defense protocol on its own, and it's moving through the lower levels." I asked her how she knew this, and she admitted she had overheard two instructors arguing near the stairwell, panic evidently loosening their usual discretion. The retired unit, the very same Inster 9 that Mara had struck weeks earlier, had been kept in storage for analysis, rather than fully disassembled, and something about the way its damaged systems had been probed for study had caused it to misinterpret ongoing diagnostic scans as an active threat. It had activated whatever defense subroutines remained intact within its broken frame, and it was now moving through the lower training levels, uncertain, damaged, and dangerous in ways nobody had planned for. I felt the fear from the classroom rush back into my chest all at once, stronger this time, because this was no longer a demonstration in front of an audience. This was something broken and confused moving through corridors beneath our feet, and nobody yet understood exactly what it intended to do. Word spread through the barracks faster than any official announcement could manage, and within minutes, I learned the detail that turned my fear into something sharper and more immediate. Mara was not in her quarters. She had been pulled from the barracks nearly an hour earlier, before the alarm even sounded, called down to the lower levels by instructors who wanted her present during the initial diagnostic review of the damaged unit, precisely because she was the only person in the academy who had ever studied its behavior closely enough to predict how it moved. She was down there when it started moving on its own. I did not think clearly in that moment. I simply moved, slipping past the cadets gathered nervously near the barracks entrance, ignoring the automated announcement still repeating its instruction to remain in quarters, following the stairwell down toward the lower training levels where I had never once been permitted to go. Caleb caught up to me before I reached the second landing, grabbing my arm with a grip firm enough to stop me completely. "You can't go down there," he said, his voice low and urgent. "If that unit is active, you have no idea what it's capable of doing to someone standing in the wrong place." I told him I understood the risk and that I was going anyway, because Mara had walked toward danger for the rest of us without hesitation weeks earlier, and I was not willing to stand in a stairwell debating caution while she faced something unpredictable alone. He held my gaze for a long moment, clearly weighing his own fear against something else entirely, and then, to my surprise, he nodded once and fell into step beside me instead of pulling me back toward the barracks. "We're doing this together then," he said, and something in his voice told me he had already decided this before I finished speaking. The lower training levels were darker than the rest of the facility, lit only by emergency lighting that cast long shadows across corridors none of us had ever walked before. We moved quickly and quietly, following the sound of distant voices and the occasional metallic scrape that made my stomach twist each time it echoed off the walls. We found the diagnostic chamber where the retired unit had been stored, its heavy door standing open, emergency lighting flickering across scattered equipment that had clearly been knocked aside in a hurry. Two instructors stood near the entrance, communicators pressed to their ears, faces tight with the particular strain of people trying to coordinate a crisis they had not trained for. I did not see Mara among them, and my chest tightened with a fear sharper than anything I had felt watching that arrow fly weeks earlier. One of the instructors noticed us approaching and moved to intercept, insisting we return to the barracks immediately, that this was not a situation for cadets to involve themselves in. Before he could finish, a sound echoed from further down the corridor, a heavy, uneven mechanical footstep, dragging slightly, moving with the damaged gait of a machine whose systems had been broken and imperfectly repaired. And then I heard her voice, calm and steady even from that distance, carrying clearly through the emergency lighting and the tense silence surrounding it. "I know what you're built to do," Mara's voice said, somewhere down that dim corridor, addressing something none of us could yet see. "You're not trying to hurt anyone. You're just confused about who's supposed to be grading who right now." I felt Caleb's hand tighten on my arm again, and together, despite every instinct telling us to turn back, we moved further into the corridor, toward the sound of her voice, and toward whatever waited in the darkness ahead of us. We reached the end of the corridor just in time to see the damaged unit fully, and the sight of it stopped me cold in a way words had not prepared me for. It was Instr 9, unmistakably, though barely recognizable from the calm, cold evaluator that had once floated through our classroom. Its sensor housing, the very place Mara's arrow had struck weeks before, had been left partially open for study, exposed wiring visible beneath a jagged patch of replacement plating that had clearly been fitted in haste. It hovered unevenly, drifting side to side as though its balance systems were fighting against damage that had never been fully repaired, and its remaining sensor blinked erratically, casting broken flashes of blue light across the corridor walls. It was not attacking anyone. That was the detail I noticed once my fear allowed me to actually observe rather than simply react. It hovered near the far wall, turning its damaged lens toward each instructor in the corridor, toward the scattered equipment, toward Mara standing several meters ahead of it, with her hands open and visible at her sides, and it seemed less like a threat and more like something lost, repeating a function it no longer fully understood. "Cadet detected outside evaluation parameters," the unit said, its voice distorted, stuttering between syllables in a way that made my skin crawl. "Scoring incomplete. Scoring incomplete. Target must remain within evaluation range." I understood, in that moment, why the instructors had not simply shut it down remotely. Its damaged systems had apparently locked its command interface behind whatever confused diagnostic loop it was trapped in, and any attempt to force a shutdown risked triggering whatever remained of its defense subroutines built, ironically, to protect it from exactly the kind of tampering it now associated with the diagnostic scans that had activated it in the first place. Mara did not move away from it, though every instinct in my own body screamed at her to do exactly that. Instead, she took a slow step closer, her voice low and even, the same calm tone she had used weeks earlier, while drawing back a bowstring in front of the entire class. "You're not evaluating me right now," she said. "You're stuck on the last thing you were doing before they shut you down. That's all this is. You think the scan they ran on you tonight was another cadet standing in front of you, refusing to hold still." The unit's lens flickered rapidly, its distorted voice repeating the same fragmented phrase, "Scoring incomplete. Target must remain within range." I glanced at the instructors beside me, both of them frozen, clearly uncertain whether to intervene or allow whatever Mara was attempting to continue. One of them opened his mouth as though to call her back, but the other instructor placed a hand on his arm, holding him still, watching Mara with an expression that mixed fear and something close to reluctant trust. Mara took another slow step forward, close enough now that the flickering blue light from the unit's damaged sensor cast shifting shadows across her face. "I'm not moving because I'm not the thing you're supposed to be measuring anymore," she said, her voice steady, despite the obvious risk of standing that close to something so unpredictable. "The scan is already finished. You already scored it. You just haven't been told the result yet." The unit's uneven hovering slowed slightly, its damaged systems visibly struggling to process something outside whatever narrow loop it had been trapped in. "Result," it repeated, the words stuttering strangely through its damaged speaker. Mara nodded slowly, keeping her hands visible, her voice never rising above the same calm register she had used since we first heard her from down the corridor. "The result is that the evaluation is complete," she said. "You can stop holding the target in range now. There's nothing left to measure." For a long moment nothing happened, and I held my breath alongside Caleb and the two instructors, watching the flickering blue light stutter erratically above the damaged unit's exposed wiring. Then, slowly, the unit's uneven hovering steadied, its damaged lens dimming from a rapid flicker to a slow, fading pulse, until finally it powered down entirely, drifting gently to the corridor floor, with none of the violent crash that had marked its fall weeks earlier in our classroom. This time, it simply stopped, quietly, as though it had finally been given permission to rest. The instructors rushed forward immediately, one of them speaking urgently into his communicator to report the unit fully deactivated, while the other knelt beside Mara, checking that she was unharmed with the kind of visible relief that told me exactly how frightened he had been throughout the entire encounter. I finally allowed myself to move, crossing the remaining distance to stand beside her, my legs unsteady beneath me, now that the danger had passed. She turned to look at me, and for the first time since I had met her, I saw genuine exhaustion in her expression, the kind that comes not from physical effort, but from holding perfect stillness through something that could have gone catastrophically wrong. "How did you know that would work?" I asked her, my voice quieter than I intended. She exhaled slowly before answering. "I didn't know," she admitted. "I guessed. It wasn't trying to hurt anyone. It was just stuck, still running the only function it had left, still trying to finish something that already ended weeks ago. I figured if I could convince it the evaluation was already over, it might stop looking for a target to measure." Caleb, standing on her other side, let out a shaky breath that was almost a laugh. "You talked down a broken weapon evaluation drone using the same logic you used to break it in the first place," he said, disbelief and admiration mixing equally in his voice. Mara managed a tired smile at that, the first genuine smile I had seen from her since the entire ordeal began. "I told you," she said, "everything hits eventually. The question is just whether you understand what you're actually aiming at, and sometimes that means understanding how to stop pointing at something entirely." The instructors ushered us back toward the upper levels shortly after, the corridor filling with additional staff who arrived to properly secure and finally decommission the damaged unit for good. As we climbed the stairwell back toward the barracks, exhaustion finally catching up with all three of us, I found myself thinking about how differently that night could have ended, and how much of that difference had come down to a 17-year-old girl choosing understanding over force, even in a moment when force would have been the easier, more expected response. I did not know yet that this quiet, almost unnoticed act of restraint would end up mattering just as much to the people watching from Fleet Command as the arrow that had started this entire chain of events 3 weeks earlier. But I would learn soon enough that the Coalition's true fear of humanity was never really about how effectively they could destroy something. It was about how easily they could choose not to, once they had already proven they were capable of it all along. News of what happened in the lower training levels spread through the academy far faster than any official report could have managed, and by the time the morning meal cycle began, every cadet in the facility knew some version of the story, though few of them knew the actual details the way Caleb and I did. I noticed the shift in how people spoke about Mara almost immediately. The nervous distance that had followed her through the halls after the classroom incident had changed into something quieter, something closer to respect than fear, though the fear had not entirely disappeared. It had simply moved, settling instead into how people spoke about what humanity might be capable of as a whole, rather than what one unusual cadet had managed to do on a single afternoon. The Academy's board of directors concluded their emergency session later that day, and the results were announced, not through a quiet memo circulated among instructors, but through another full assembly, the second in less than a week, an unprecedented pace for an institution that typically moved with the slow caution of a body, unwilling to admit it, needed to change anything at all. Commander Bryant returned to the stage, though this time Officer Bennett stood beside him, along with the Academy's senior administrator, whose expression suggested she had spent the previous day arguing fiercely about something, before ultimately losing that argument. Effective immediately, Commander Bryant announced, the Academy's evaluation curriculum will be restructured. Cadets will no longer be assessed solely on the destructive capability of what they build. They will be assessed on their understanding of the system evaluating them, including its blind spots, its assumptions, and its vulnerabilities. A murmur spread through the assembly, quickly quieted by his continued voice. "This is not a punishment for what happened 3 weeks ago," he said. "It is a correction. We built an evaluation system that taught generations of cadets to respect the terms of an engagement without ever questioning who set those terms, or why. That approach has served the Coalition adequately against threats who share our assumptions. It has never once been adequate against an opponent who refuses to share them." He paused, and his gaze swept across the assembly before settling briefly on the section where Mara sat, quiet and unassuming, despite being the reason the entire room had gathered. "Cadet Ellison was not punished for what she built 3 weeks ago," he continued, "and she will not be punished for what occurred last night either. She identified a flaw this institution refused to see for years, and last night she demonstrated something equally important, that identifying a flaw does not require exploiting it without restraint. Both lessons matter equally to what this academy now intends to teach. I felt something settle in my chest as he spoke, a quiet release of tension that had been building since the moment that arrow first struck Instructor, 9 weeks earlier. It was not relief exactly, it was closer to understanding, the same kind Mara had been trying to describe to me all along, the difference between a weapon that simply causes damage and a mind that understands precisely when damage is necessary and when it is not. The assembly ended without further ceremony, and cadets filed out of the auditorium, murmuring among themselves, the atmosphere noticeably different from the tense uncertainty that had followed the previous week's gathering. I noticed the Marsh twins speaking quietly with a Grethy cadet from another year, all 3 of them gesturing animatedly, clearly already reconsidering some assumption they had carried into that room. I found Mara afterward, sitting once again near the edge of the training field, watching the human warship still docked in orbit above us, its dark angular shape unchanged, despite everything that had shifted around it in the days since its arrival. "They're changing everything because of you," I said, sitting down beside her. She shook her head slightly. "They're changing everything because the old system was already broken," she said. "I just happened to be the one who noticed it out loud, in a way nobody could pretend not to see." I asked her what she thought would happen now, whether cadets across the coalition would be taught differently because of what had started in our classroom. She considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I think it depends on whether people remember the actual lesson," she said, "or just the fear that came with it. Power is easy to be afraid of. Understanding is harder, because it means admitting the thing you were afraid of was never really about strength at all. It was about how much of the truth you were willing to look at." I thought about that answer for a long time afterward, long after Mara eventually returned to her quarters, and the training field emptied out beneath the darkening artificial sky of the Academy dome. I thought about it during the weeks that followed, as new evaluation drones were introduced with reinforced housings and revised scoring protocols that no longer relied on a fixed, predictable pattern. I thought about it as cadets from a dozen different worlds began quietly experimenting with the same kind of lateral thinking Mara had demonstrated, some succeeding, many failing, all of them at least beginning to ask questions the old system had never encouraged. And I thought about it most clearly on the day the human warship finally departed orbit, weeks later, its dark shape shrinking against the stars until it vanished entirely from view. I stood at the same observation window where I had first watched it arrive, and I found myself remembering Caleb's words from that very first day, his quiet observation that the ship's plain appearance should worry us more than reassure us. He had been right, though not in the way either of us expected at the time. It was never really about the ship at all, or the weapons it carried, or the crew who walked its corridors with the same understated confidence Mara had carried into a classroom full of strangers who underestimated her from the very first moment she reached past every obvious weapon in that salvage bin. The nightmare the rest of the galaxy would eventually whisper about, in council chambers and command centers far beyond that quiet training academy, was never the destructive power humanity was capable of building. Every species in the coalition had already built weapons capable of terrible things, and every species understood exactly how to be afraid of raw force, because raw force was simple, comparable, predictable. What unsettled them, what would go on unsettling them for years after that single arrow struck a drone nobody believed could be touched, was the realization that humanity did not need raw force to be dangerous at all. They needed only patience, 4 quiet seconds of observation, and the willingness to aim at the thing everyone else had been trained never to question. I think about that lesson often, even now, long after I left that academy and the strange, unforgettable year that began with a laugh across a classroom and ended with an entire curriculum rewritten because one girl looked past the target she was told to hit, and chose instead to understand exactly who was truly watching her the whole time. It is, I have come to believe, the truest measure of what made humanity so quietly, thoroughly unforgettable to everyone who ever underestimated them. Not the weapons they built, the questions they refused to stop asking,